I don't think Tom could hear me. I said, how come y'all get to me so fast at night? Doesn't seem like they take that. I mean, it takes a lot longer in the morning. Just kidding, though. If you remember from last week, we started our addressing the question, can you tell me about the churches of Christ? But more specifically, why you don't use musical instruments. And we took a look at the history from the time of the apostles up to about the 19th century, that what was used in the churches was a cappella, vocal only singing. They had some few isolated incidents of instruments coming in, but around the 1830s, a lot of denominational churches was bringing in instruments. And so we talked and we looked at all that, wondering why, or tonight we're going to address the wondering why all the leaders, the fathers, the theologians, and all the people that we addressed last week, Luther, Calvin, Clark, and several others, why they all was in agreement that musical instruments were not allowed in the assemblies. And we left off, I said I'd like to take a walk through the Bible now and see if we can see what they saw, why they came to that conclusion. So tonight I'd like to take a brief walk through the Bible so we can see, again, just how they came up with their answer, how they arrived at their conclusion. I'd like to begin a walk through the Old Testament with Moses, when the tabernacle was the center of public worship for God's people. Soon after giving birth to the nation of Israel through that miraculous or miracle-filled exodus from Egypt, God drafted and delivered legislation to address nearly every aspect of their national life, and that included worship. In his legislation and instructions for worship, God regulated everything from the specifics of the building of the tabernacle to its furnishings to the clothing, responsibilities of the priest, the sacrifices to be offered, and the musical instruments that were to be played. When it came to the use of musical instruments in worship, God specifically instructed Moses on which instrument to use, who could use them, when they could be used. So let's open up our Bible and look at what God told him in Numbers 10. And we'll look at several verses here. Verses 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, make 2 silver trumpets. He didn't say horns. He said, I want trumpets. Well, how many? I want 2. What color? They're to be silver. Make 2 silver trumpets for yourself, and you shall make them of hammered work. I don't want poured metal. I want hammered work. It makes a different sound. This is what I want. You shall use them for calling the congregation and for directing the movements of the camps. Go ahead, Jim. And the sons of Aaron and the priests shall blow the trumpets, and they shall be to you as an ordinance forever throughout your generation. We'll drop down to 10. Also, in the day of your gladness, your appointed feast, and at the beginnings of your month, you shall blow the trumpets over the burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings. And they shall be a memorial for you before God. I am the Lord your God. So God gave them specific instructions on what to do this. And we can see from that passage alone, if we really look at it, it was only God who had the authority to do that. He told them exactly what he wanted. Just like I mentioned, he said, I want horns. I want trumpets. I want 2 silver trumpets. You know, I can't imagine anybody thinking that Moses had the authority to add to that. Nor could I think that anybody could really think that Moses had the authority to say, nah, we're not going to play those two trumpets. I kind of like the sound of this horn better. He didn't say that, even though he was God's right-hand man, and he had privileges like no other man had. But yet, God was still in control. He had to do what God said and use the instruments that God said and do the worship the way God said. So in the tabernacle, there was no choice. God told him exactly what to do. So let's go to temple worship. Years later, when God's people were firmly settled in the Promised Land and the Ark of the Covenant was permanently in its place, located in their capital of Jerusalem. Remember, we talked about that too, and David tried to do it on his own. Tried to move that covenant. It didn't end too well for one fella. He lost his life because David hadn't researched to see what God had said. But it was permanently located in their capital city of Jerusalem, which is the center of worship, when they moved from the tabernacle worship to temple worship. This transition occurred under King David around 1000 BC or so. And he made some distinct changes to God's worship. One of those changes was the addition of several musical instruments. Now I say he made them, we're going to take a look at that. But let's notice in 1 Chronicles 16 what he says here, what the Lord tells us. We're going to look at several verses here. Then he appointed some of the Levites as minister before the ark of the Lord to invoke, to thank, and to praise the God of Israel. Asaph was the chief, and second to him was Zechariah. Jeiel, Shemiramoth, Jehiel, Matthiah, Eliab, Benaiah, Obed-Edom, and Jeiel, who were to play the harps and lyres. Asaph was to sound the cymbals, and Benaiah and Jehiziel, the priests, were to blow the trumpets regularly before the Ark of the Covenant of God. Who slid that slide in there with all those names? Let's look over to 1 Chronicles, verses 1 through 5. Let's take a look at this. Starting in chapter 23, 1 through 5. So it says, So when David was old and full of days, he made his son Solomon king over Israel. And he gathered together all the leaders of Israel with the priests and the Levites. Now the Levites were numbered from the age of 30 years and above, and the number of the individuals' males was 38,000. Of these, 24,000 were to look after the work of the house of the Lord. 6,000 were officers and judges. 4,000 were gatekeepers. But look here. And 4,000 praised the Lord with musical instruments, which I made, said David, for giving praise. As we learned a moment ago, in tabernacle worship, there was only 2 silver trumpets that were blown during specific times when God ordered them. But now David comes along and adds harps and lyres. That's the string type, not the pants on fire type. And cymbals to mix in temple worship. The big question is, why did David do this? Did David have authority to do this? This is a place where a lot of the denominations stop. They look at this and say, well, David added these in. I can add them in. We can add them in. But that's not exactly correct. But that's what they use to advocate to bring in instruments into worship service. That's what they used to supplement or to supplant God's will. Was he just not a fan of trumpet-only music? And he decided to add some musical variety in hopes it would enhance his own worship experience? Not quite. Maybe he did it because he thought some new instruments would enhance the worship experience for some fellow temple goers. That's not it either. Perhaps he was given in to the temple goers of his day who was demanding bigger and better worship bands. He didn't cower down to them. It's only through a genuine study that we will see why David added these. If we go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 29, we're fast forwarding about 300 years here to the reign of Hezekiah. And it records how Hezekiah restored the temple worship and the reason that David brought the instruments in. So let's pick up the reading here in 25. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with stringed instruments, and with harps, according to the commandments of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. For thus was the command of the Lord by his prophet. There it is. The reason why David introduced musical instruments into worship. He did not have the right to do that on his own accord. It was done by God's command. So that reading tonight in your hearing, that 2 Chronicles 29 and 25 collapses that faulty argument that advocates of adding musical instruments into worship to supplant God's instructions that he has given. David's command for which instruments to be used in the temple were God's command, just as Moses' commands for the instruments to be used in the tabernacle was God's commands. And David himself made it clear when he handed over the reins to his son that those detailed plans of the temple and its service and everything about them came from the Lord. Let's go back to 1 Chronicles 28 for a minute and look at a couple of verses here, 11 through 13 and then 19. Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the vestibule, its houses, its treasuries, its upper chambers, its inner chambers, and the place of the mercy seat, and the plans for all that he had by the Spirit of the courts of the house of the Lord, of all the chambers all around, of the treasuries of the house of God, and of the treasuries for the dedicated things, also for the division of the priests and the Levites, for all the work of the service of the house of the Lord, and for all the articles of service in the house of the Lord. Let's drop down to 19, if you're following along. And this, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing, by his hand upon me, all the works of these plans. You see it? David said, I didn't have the right to do this. I didn't change this. He said, all of these instructions come from your God, from God Almighty. He received every detail that he passed on to his son. You know, if it doesn't seem obvious yet, let me show you a few more passages that I think will help convince you that no human being has the freedom to change any detail of the temple worship, including which instruments were to be used. You know, we looked at the first part of the passage in 2 Chronicles 29 just a moment ago, but I want to look at a slightly expanded version of it now, from 25 to 29. And let's listen to the whole thought here. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with stringed instruments, and with harps, according to the commandment of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. The Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah commanded them to offer the burnt offering on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord also began, with the trumpets and with the instruments of David, the king of Israel. So all the assembly worshiped, the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. And when they had finished offering, the king and all who were present with him bowed and worshipped. Think about what we just read. When Hezekiah set out to restore temple worship, and this is about 300 years after David's death, he didn't look around him to see how they wanted to build the temple or rebuild the temple. He didn't look to the culture to see, hey, have we invented any new stuff? Can we bring this in? He understood he didn't have the authority to add anything, nor did he have the authority to take anything away. So what did he do? He looked back. He looked back to what he had, and he seen the commandments that the Lord had given David, and how David had read what the Lord had given Moses. The horns were never taken away. The trumpets were never taken away. But God added to them. So, obviously, Ezekiel knew who had the authority to add or to change. So, with the restoration of the temple, he wanted to do it to please God, not to please himself or to please the culture of that time. Let's fast forward about another 200 years. That puts us roughly 500 years after David. And it brings us to a time in history when the Israelites were rebuilding the temple again after the Babylonians reduced it to rubble. The men who were handed the reins on this building project was Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And we can read in Ezra, when the foundation, Ezra 10, when the foundation of the new temple was laid, Ezra gave his report from the scene, and this is what Ezra said. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests stood in their apparel with trumpets. You reckon they were the 2 silver trumpets? And the Levites, the son of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord according to the ordinance of David, the king of Israel. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's what we just read earlier with Hezekiah. When Zerubbabel and Jeshua reinstituted the temple worship, their approach was precisely the same as Hezekiah, some 200 years earlier. They did everything, including choosing the instruments in accordance with the instruments of David. And David was told by God through the prophets what he was supposed to have. So let's fast forward one more time. And now we're going to hit about 550 years. So we're going to fast forward about 50 more years since God first revealed his plan to David on what to do. Now, once again, the temple needs rebuilding after a long time of decay. God taps the man on the shoulder this time, Nehemiah. And he is the shortest man in the Bible, not me, Tim. Nehemiah, the children know it. Like she knows it. So they tapped Nehemiah on the shoulder and commissioned him to lead the resurrection or the restoration. And here's what part of the restoration looked like in his time. Nehemiah 12. We'll look at some verses here. And the heads of the Levites was Hashabiah, and Sherebiah and Jeshua, to praise and to give thanks according to the commandments of David, the man of God, watch by watch. We drop down to 35 and 36. And some of the priest's sons with trumpets and with musical instruments of David, the man of God, and Ezra the scribe went on before them. One more. Both of the singers and the gatekeepers kept charge of. Let me try that again. Both of the singers and the gatekeepers kept the charge of their God and the charge of purification, according to the commandments of David and Solomon, his son. Again, don't you find that amazing? That, especially when you think about our time here, we're talking about a 550-year period here. America's getting ready to celebrate their 250th birthday. And most of the time, we're trying to look forward, trying to decide, well, here's how everything's changed. Here's how we need to add. Here's what pleases people now. That's one thing you didn't see really in the Bible through God. God said, this is mine. If I am the object of worship, I get to decide what worship I'm going to accept. I don't care what the masses like. This is what I want. So the people of the Old Testament, they understood this. They kept looking backwards to see what are we supposed to be doing. And in some of our first talks, we talked about the Reformation and the Restoration. Each time this temple was rebuilt, it went through a restoration period, going back to the original design, going back to what God told them He wanted them to do, how He wanted to be worshipped. So in comparison with today, we keep wanting to change things. You know, it's a bad adage, since we're not the object of worship. There's a fault. It's a faulty thought when we think, well, God made me and I like this music, therefore God must like this music. That's a bad assumption on our part. God told us exactly what He wants. And that's what we're supposed to do. Nehemiah understood this. Hezekiah understood this. Zerubbabel and Jeshua understood this. So let's leave Moses and David and the age of temple worship and move over into the New Testament times. When it comes to deciding whether or not to use musical instrument in Christian worship, most believers from the time of the apostles until about the 19th century, just like we talked about, found nothing in the New Testament that suggests that God had delegated this decision to people. Just because He didn't say, here's what I want, we cannot assume that He gave up that right, that He delegated that to man. As specific as He was in the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament is done away with. However, it's there for our learning. And since God doesn't change, God very specifically gave instructions of what He wanted. He didn't relinquish anything. So in the New Testament times, just because He doesn't say, here's what I want, that doesn't mean He relinquished command to that. So we cannot add or subtract anything in there. You know, but while the tabernacle worshipers consulted the instructions of Moses, and the temple worshipers instructed Hezekiah, Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, and David, who do the Christians of this era go to? Do we go back to Moses and to David? I see a lot of heads going, no. We go to the apostles to see what they say and what directions they gave on musical instruments. In this New Testament system, God dramatically changes how people would worship him. He revealed his new plans through the apostles. And that's why the early church devoted themselves to the apostles. If we look at Acts 2 and 42, we'll see that. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers. They looked to the apostles instead of Moses. The apostles were delivering God's legislation and his instructions on how he wanted them to be. You can see a good example of the apostles exercising this God-giving authority over Christian worship when Paul takes an out-of-control congregation in Corinth, this assembly, and when he first wrote them, he brought order to their chaos by establishing some clear rules for speakers. In 1 Corinthians 14, 26 through 23. I don't think I made a slide on that, Tim, so you're not missing it, are you? I did put it in there. How is it then, brethren, when you come together, that each of you have a psalms, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation? Let all things be done for edification. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be two, or at the most three, each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. Let 2 or 3 of the prophets speak, and let the others judge. But if anything is revealed to another who sits by, then the first shall keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be encouraged, and the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Therefore, for some reason I sing therefore. If anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize the things which I write to you are the Lord's commandments. But if anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. And that was from the NASB version. Paul punctuates with, if anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge the things that I am writing to you are commands of the Lord. And if you don't recognize this, you're not recognized. Obviously, by this, the Corinthians were not free to do whatever they wanted to in their worship. Obviously, by this, God expected them to follow Paul's orders. Since God reveals his plan to Christian worship through his apostles, when it came to the question of whether or not to use instruments, most believers throughout history that we looked at asked, well, what instruments do the apostles command us to use? And they always came back with the same answer: none. Absolutely zero. As the church fathers, the reformers, the Puritans, as they scoured the pages of the New Testament, they found commands to sing and praise to God. Let's look at a couple of them. Ephesians 5:19. We've looked at these before. But speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Colossians 3:16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. And they found examples of believers praising him in song. Is anyone among you, this is James. Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing. And they found examples of believers praising him in song. Here in Acts 16. Maybe I didn't put that one in there. When at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And now I know that wasn't in the assembly, but still, they were praying and singing hymns to God. And the prisoners were looking to them. What about 1 Corinthians 14 and 15? What is the conclusion then? I will pray with the Spirit, and I will also pray with understanding. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with understanding. But they could not find one hint of musical instruments in the worship. Some of you may know the name of LeGrand Smith or F. LeGrand Smith. He's pretty much preached or served in churches of Christ all over the world. And he was right when he wrote this, at least in my way of thinking. In contrast to many Old Testament passages referring to musical instrument in temple worship, in the New Testament text, not one sound of a musical instrument is heard. Not a trumpet, not a harp, not the quietest jingle of a tambourine. Singing? Yes. Musical instruments? No. Relative to musical instrument, there is only an ominous, haunting silence. Even those who do worship with musical instruments, with a good study, they should also be able to admit that that's not right, that God never authorized that. For Christians throughout history, all of these things add up to a simple conclusion. Since God didn't place any instruments in Christian worship, there's not going to be any instruments in Christian worship. We're not going to bring in instruments in Christian worship. For most of us in the churches of Christ, of course, I can't speak to everyone. Each congregation is autonomous. That's the way God designed it. There's not a headquarters that we call to check this out. But for most of us in the churches of Christ, we believe in the historic Christian approach to instruments, and that the the worship without them is theologically sound. Here's a quick summary of what we went over. In the Old Testament, God alone had authority to use to prescribe instruments and their use and what they were to be used for. That was in the temple and the tabernacle. God specified places and specific instruments in both the tabernacle and the temple worship, and no person has authority to add to or take those away. He placed them there. As God inaugurated his new covenant, there's nothing in the New Testament to suggest he gave up the authority over the use of musical instruments. He didn't tell it. He wasn't just silent so we could add what we wanted to add. If God wanted the instruments in Christian worship, through the reading of the Bible, it's reasonable to conclude, if we read the whole Bible, that they're not there because he didn't place them there. And if he wanted them there, the apostles, his chosen men, would have told us, just like the prophets told Moses, what name am I looking for? Told David what God wanted. The apostles didn't tell us anything about musical instruments. There's not a single command in there from the apostles on what instrument to use. For us, all this only adds up to one conclusion: that God did not authorize musical instruments in his church, nor does he want to be praised like that. And like I said, with God being the object of worship and the author of Christianity, he gets to tell us what he wants. We don't get to tell him what we're going to give him and expect him to say, "Oh, thank you." That's just not, it doesn't work. You know, I don't know if any of you have ever read a book. It's a book that I've been reading here, especially on this topic here. I tried to get a slide to print out like that, but I don't think it ever came out right. But the book is by John Price. He published it in 2005. It's called Old Light on New Worship, Musical Instruments and the Worship of God, a Theological, Historical, and Sociological Study. It's a very interesting book. He really breaks it down to the details that God gave, and he tears them apart and looks at it on why this isn't here. I mean, without a doubt, he really sheds light on it. But what's interesting about it is when you think about this, the concept of restoration. The restoring the beliefs and practices of the church in the New Testament times. That's what made me start reading this from advice on another. But John Price was a Reformed Baptist minister from New York. And in the preface, he explains how this book came into being. Now keep in mind, most Reformed Baptist churches, most all, use one instrument to accompany their singing, and that's a piano. But I'll let Mr. Price take it from here. He says, more than 3 years ago, and I didn't really catch which date this was, but it was published in 2005. But he said, more than 3 years ago, a study was concluded in a sister Reformed Baptist church with the conclusion that various musical instruments are warranted in New Testament worship. He said these audio tapes of this study came into possession of one of the members within his congregation, and they got passed on to him. And later, he became aware that these tapes were having a wider distribution and some influence along Reformed Baptists. They were starting to add more instruments into their worship series. So he said, I listened to those tapes and I realized that further study was necessary on this subject. And what began as a relative brief study developed over time to this book that he wrote. So Price, after presenting the fruits of his exhaustive study to the congregation, they came to a conclusion on their use of the piano. Now remember, their choices was to remain committed to the historic use of the one instrument that they've used to worship with is for as long as anyone can remember, or acknowledge that musical instruments in worship are permitted and they can add what they want to. What do you think they chose? They chose neither. They said, here's what happened. As a result of this study, we have become convinced that we should no longer use any musical instruments to accompany our congregational singing. That's pretty interesting. It kind of reminds me of one of the passages that we talked about early on, Nehemiah 8. When those people were sitting around hearing the word of God preached to them again, and they started reading the part about how they were supposed to be in the stick huts during the time of the festival, and they in effect said, wow, that's enough study for today. We're supposed to be sitting around in these huts while observing this feast. Let's go get these huts built. In that same spirit, this Reformed Baptist church said, wow, we're not supposed to be using this piano in our worship. Let's get rid of it. My prayer and my hope is that more Bible believers will embrace with that same spirit of restoration and worship and choose to return to simple New Testament practice of vocal-only praise. You know, granted, that'd be some radical change, but restoration is usually startling and radical. And that's why true restoration demands boldness. May we all have the boldness to follow the will of God no matter what. You know, that concludes my lessons on musical praise in the assembly and why we in the churches of Christ sing vocal only, unaccompanied by musical instruments? Because the author of Christianity has not told us to use them. I hope that answered more questions than it created.